Queen Seralith of the Aurelian Empire walked through her silent palace the same way she did every night, with slow and steady steps that hid the storm inside her. To the outside world, she was a strong ruler, respected and admired for her wisdom. But inside the palace walls, everyone knew the truth that visitors from other worlds could never guess. The queen spent every night alone, completely isolated from her own people. It was not by choice. It was because of the strange empathic energy inside her, a power inherited by the royal bloodline, a power that grew unstable at night and could overwhelm anyone around her. Her emotions were strong enough to shake the atmosphere of the palace, and no one had the courage to face it with her. Every night the palace halls emptied long before sunset. Guards stayed only at distant posts, and servants rushed to finish their tasks early. As the last rays of the sun faded behind the golden spires of the capital city, the queen's large chamber doors closed, leaving her in the vast, quiet space with only her own echoing footsteps. This was her routine, the life she had accepted for years. Her throne room was full of ministers by day, but by night it became a place of darkness and solitude. But that night, something was different. A new delegation had arrived from Earth earlier in the cycle. Humans were not common visitors to the Aurelian Empire, but their reputation had spread across many systems. They were known for resilience, stubbornness, and a strange emotional strength that other species found surprising. The queen had heard of humans but had never met one directly. She expected nothing unusual from their visit. She thought they would negotiate, sign agreements, and leave like everyone else. But among them was one human who paid attention to things others ignored. His name was Captain Elias Ward, a calm and observant officer with sharp eyes and a steady voice. While other visitors admired the beauty of the palace or focused on trade discussions, Elias noticed something else. He noticed how the palace guards stiffened their backs when evening approached. He noticed how servants whispered to each other and kept glancing at the position of the sun. He even noticed, during an afternoon meeting, how the queen's expression changed when a minister mentioned the night cycle, a faint sadness, almost invisible, but there. Elias was curious. Humans were naturally curious, but his curiosity was different. It was the kind that made him step forward when others stepped back. So he asked a guard what happens after sunset. The guard hesitated, looked around to confirm no one important was listening, and whispered the truth. The queen spent her nights alone because her power became dangerous after dark. No one stayed with her. They feared being overwhelmed, even losing control of their own minds. Elias found that idea disturbing. A ruler, powerful and respected, yet completely alone every single night. That did not sit right with him. He thought about how heavy that must feel, how long she had carried this burden without any help. And as the evening approached, Elias made a decision. In her chamber, Queen Seralith stood on the balcony as the city lights began to flicker alive below. She looked calm, but inside, she braced for the shift she always felt when night began. Her empathic energy rose slowly like a quiet wave, then stronger, like a tide climbing higher. She closed her eyes, preparing for the long hours ahead. Then she heard footsteps. She turned sharply, her eyes widening in disbelief. No one was supposed to be here. The guards should have locked the doors. Yet there he was, the human named Elias, standing inside her chamber doorway, not afraid, not confused, simply present. "You should leave," she said immediately, her voice steady but urgent. "It is not safe when night begins." Elias did not move. "I know," he replied calmly. "I was told, but I don't think you should be alone." The queen stared at him, unable to understand why any being would make such a foolish choice. "You don't know what you are risking," she said. "My power is not like yours. It touches the mind. It can overwhelm you." "I know that too," he answered with a small, steady breath. "But I want to be here." Her heart pounded. Her aura pulsed, rising more quickly now because of her sudden surprise. She took a step back and said again, "You need to leave." Elias stepped forward instead. That moment was something the Queen had never experienced before. Someone moving toward her during the night, not away. She felt fear for him, concern for his safety, and a strange feeling she had not felt in years: hope. A small, fragile hope that maybe she did not have to face the night alone. Her aura surged again, stronger this time, a wave of emotion that spread through the room. Elias felt it immediately, like a heavy pressure in the air around him. It wasn't painful, but it was intense. Full of years of suppressed feelings, loneliness, and power she could not control. He steadied his breathing. Humans were used to emotional storms. They lived through stress, crisis, and struggle all the time. He grounded himself like he had been trained to do in harsh environments. "What you feel," the Queen said softly, "is only the beginning. It will grow." "I'll stay," he replied firmly. The Queen did not understand him. "Why?" she asked. "Why would a human risk himself like this?" Elias smiled a little, not confidently, but kindly. "Because no one should face the dark alone." Her breath caught. Those words reached deeper than he could have known. She had always believed isolation was her duty, her responsibility, her burden. No one had ever questioned it. No one had ever asked if she wanted it to be different. But this human was asking with his presence, without accusation or pity. The night continued to deepen. Her aura spread like a shimmering field of energy, colors barely visible to the eye vibrating softly in the air. Elias stood there, feeling its weight but refusing to step back. The Queen watched him closely, expecting him to collapse like others who had accidentally stayed too long near her in the past. But he did not. He swayed a little, took a deep breath, but stayed firm. The Queen felt a strange sensation inside her, her own emotions reacting to his. She sensed his calmness, his grounded mind, his steady presence. It helped stabilize the storm within her, even if only a little. She had never felt such balance during the night. Her powers usually grew wild, difficult to contain. But now, something was different. Elias spoke gently from across the room, trying to keep her anchored. "Tell me something," he said. "Anything. Something about your world." The question was simple, but it gave her mind something to hold on to. She told him about the colors of the Aurelian sunrise, about how their sky shimmered with metallic hues because of the mineral-rich atmosphere. She told him how her people once believed the dawn was a message of renewal. As she spoke, her aura fluctuated but did not explode outward like usual. Elias listened with real interest, nodding, asking small questions, grounding her unintentionally with his calm voice. The Queen realized that she had not talked to someone during the night in many years. She had forgotten what it felt like. Time passed slowly, but for the first time, it did not feel suffocating. Elias occasionally staggered from the pressure, but he steadied himself each time. The Queen watched him with a mixture of astonishment and gratitude. She had imagined humans as fragile beings, driven by curiosity, but easily overwhelmed. Yet here was one standing against a force that trained warriors could not handle. She even asked him a question of her own. "Does this not frighten you?" she said quietly. "A little," Elias admitted honestly. "But it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like something I should do." His honesty struck her more deeply than any bravado ever could. Most people tried to hide their fear around her. Elias didn't. He faced it. As the hours passed, her aura settled into a softer rhythm. The Queen felt her mind clearer than she had in years during the night cycle. She looked at Elias and found herself thinking of something she hadn't dared imagine. Perhaps she was not meant to carry everything alone. And then, without warning, The first light of dawn touched the horizon. Her aura weakened instantly, sinking like a retreating wave. Elias let out a long breath and leaned against the wall, exhausted, but smiling. "You stayed," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "I said I would," he replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I'll come again tonight." The Queen's heart tightened. She had no words at first. She only watched him with silent astonishment, overwhelmed not by her own power, but by the simple act of a human choosing to stay. For the first time in her life, Dawn felt beautiful. The next night arrived with the same quiet anticipation that had filled the palace the evening before. But now there was a difference. Queen Sarilith did not feel the usual tension of isolation. The memory of the human who had stayed beside her lingered in her mind, making the coming hours feel less like a battle to survive and more like something she had never known: hope. She moved through the palace halls with a lightness she hadn't felt in years, her steps echoing softly on the polished floors. Her attendants, noticing her unusual calm, exchanged whispers. Even the guards appeared less tense. Elias had returned, as he promised. He had spent the day learning more about the Aurelian Empire, asking questions and observing quietly. He had been briefed about the Queen's power, studied basic strategies to stay grounded, and practiced mental techniques to withstand the surge of empathic energy he expected. But nothing had prepared him for the reality of standing near the Queen at night. Even so, he did not hesitate. When the chamber doors closed and the last light of the city faded, he was ready. The Queen stood on the balcony as the first waves of her energy began to rise. Elias stepped forward and met her eyes. Unlike the previous night, there was no hesitation. She could feel it immediately. His presence was steady, calm, and focused. She had expected the human to be cautious, even fearful, but he remained firm, a silent promise that he would not abandon her to the darkness of her own mind. The empathic waves began to swell, a gentle hum at first, then growing stronger with every passing moment. The Queen's mind, accustomed to guiding and controlling her power alone, reacted to his presence in ways she had not anticipated. Her energy did not push outward wildly as it usually did. Instead, it formed a protective rhythm around them, shaped and softened by Elias's calm focus. She watched him, astonished and a little fearful of what this connection might mean. "Why do you do this?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of her aura. Elias smiled faintly. "Because someone needs to be here. Because no one should be alone with their own storm, if it can be helped." The Queen's pulse quickened. She had never heard anyone speak like this to her. Not her ministers, not her people, not the advisors who came from distant worlds. She had spent centuries being revered, obeyed, even feared, yet never understood. Elias did not speak with awe or caution. He spoke with clarity and care, and that mattered more than she expected. The night deepened. The waves of energy pulsed, rising and falling in an unpredictable pattern. Each surge carried memories and emotions, centuries of duty, the burden of her family's legacy, the loneliness that had become a part of her being. Other beings would have run, would have screamed, would have lost themselves in the tide. But Elias held firm, grounding himself with slow, deliberate breaths, letting her storm pass over him without resistance or fear. The Queen found herself speaking as she never had before. She told him of the first time she realized her power was dangerous, of the mistakes she had made in her youth, when emotions overwhelmed her and servants had been accidentally affected. She spoke of her family, their triumphs, and the crushing weight of expectations placed upon her. The words tumbled out, unplanned, because she felt safe in his presence, something she had never felt with anyone. Elias listened. He asked questions when appropriate, simple questions that encouraged her to focus her thoughts. He did not try to control her, nor did he judge her. Instead, he became a quiet anchor, a grounding point amid the storm of her own emotions. As the hours passed, the queen felt the rhythm of her power settle into a pattern she could manage. She realized she could now control her aura without shutting herself off from the world. In the quiet moments between the surges, she looked at him and saw something remarkable. He was ordinary in appearance, a human like many others, yet extraordinary in spirit. It was not his strength or skill that impressed her, but his determination, his willingness to endure something he did not fully understand. In that moment, the queen understood that the essence of strength was not only in power, but also in the courage to face what others would flee from. The night wore on, and slowly, the waves of energy began to stabilize. For the first time in her life, Queen Serelith felt an almost complete sense of control while facing the darkness she had once feared. She noticed that Elias had a calm smile on his face, even though she could sense his exhaustion. He had adapted to her power in ways she had not imagined possible, and she felt a deep respect growing inside her. "You are different from the others," she said softly. "No one has ever stayed like this before." "I'm not special," he said simply. "I'm just here, and I think you deserve not to be alone." Her pulse slowed. She had spent her life surrounded by people who obeyed or feared her, and she had grown used to being alone. But Elias's words, so simple and sincere, filled a space in her heart she had long forgotten existed. It was a strange feeling, a mix of relief, gratitude, and something she could not yet name. Outside the palace, the city lights shone faintly in the distance. The Aurelian citizens had long accepted that their queen was a solitary figure, a being too powerful for normal companionship. They whispered legends about her strength and her night cycles, but no one had ever questioned the isolation she endured. Now, unseen by the city, a small change had begun. For the first time, the queen's solitude was shared, and with it came the possibility of hope. Elias continued to guide her through the night. He spoke of simple things, stories of his own world, the ways humans face challenges without panicking, how they supported each other in small and unexpected ways. These stories became a framework for her mind, helping her structure her power without fear. She realized that this human was teaching her something greater than control. He was teaching her trust, patience, and the strength that came from accepting help. The queen noticed that her thoughts, once scattered and chaotic during the night cycle, now had focus. She could feel every pulse of her aura without being consumed by it. The storms within her mind were no longer frightening. They were a force she could direct. And as she directed it, she saw Elias not as a student or a helper, but as a partner in facing the darkness. He did not command her, nor did he try to dominate the storm. He simply existed as a steady presence, and that made all the difference. Hours passed, but the night felt different than it had in all her previous years. The energy waves finally slowed, fading gently with the first hints of dawn. Elias, exhausted yet steady, leaned lightly against the wall, smiling faintly. He had survived another night beside the queen's power, and he had done so with his spirit intact. "You stayed again," the queen said, almost in disbelief. "I told you I would," he said, "and I will as long as you need me." She felt a strange warmth in her chest, a small but powerful feeling that seemed to expand with every word. She had been alone for centuries, burdened by duty and fear, and now, with this human beside her, she felt something she had never allowed herself to hope for: companionship. For the first time, the queen realized that perhaps her life could change. Perhaps she did not have to endure the night cycles alone. Perhaps there was someone who could face the darkness with her, someone whose presence could calm the storm rather than succumb to it. It was a realization both thrilling and terrifying. She had never let anyone close enough to share her vulnerability. And yet, here was a human who had not only faced it, but had done so with courage and compassion. Over the following weeks, the nightly meetings became routine. The Queen found herself looking forward to the hours of shared solitude, where she could release her power safely and speak without fear of judgment. Elias became more than a presence. He became a guide, a friend, and a source of stability she had never known she needed. Each night, they explored not only the patterns of her power, but also the stories of their lives, their worlds, and their perspectives. She learned about Earth, about humans' resilience, their small acts of kindness, and their ability to endure hardship without losing hope. And Elias learned about the Aurelian Empire, about the burdens of leadership, the delicate balance of power, and the deep responsibility of a ruler whose strength could shape the lives of thousands. He marveled at her wisdom, her strategic mind, and the way she carried her solitude with grace, even if it had weighed heavily on her. Together they formed a bond that neither of them fully understood at first. It was built not on necessity or duty, but on choice, trust, and the quiet courage of facing something frightening side by side. The Queen discovered that her power, once a lonely burden, could be a shared force, a connection rather than a weapon. And Elias discovered that humans could adapt and endure far more than they were often given credit for, even in the presence of forces far beyond their world. The Empire itself began to sense the change, though few understood its source. Guards and attendants noticed the Queen's calm demeanor during the day. Ministers remarked on the unusual serenity in her expression. Even visitors from other species began to sense the subtle shift in her energy. The Queen, once feared for her isolation and unpredictable power, now projected an aura of controlled strength. And it was all because a human had chosen to stand beside her when no one else dared. By the end of the night, as dawn painted the sky with pale light, the Queen finally allowed herself a quiet smile. She had faced the darkness once again, and this time she had not faced it alone. Elias, standing tired but steady, met her gaze with understanding. They shared no words, yet the silence spoke volumes. For the first time in centuries, the Queen's night was no longer a prison. It had become a place of learning, trust, and quiet companionship. And though the challenges of ruling an empire would never disappear, she now carried something new: hope. Hope that she could face the nights without fear, hope that she could trust another being with her most vulnerable self, and hope that perhaps the Queen, who had always stood alone, could finally stand with someone at her side. The days after Elias's nightly visits began to change more than just the Queen's nights. They changed the empire itself, though few realized it at first. Queen Serelith walked through the palace halls with an ease she had not known for centuries. Her power, once feared for its unpredictability, now seemed steady even during the daylight hours. Ministers whispered to each other, noting her calmer presence and the focus in her eyes. The guards, once tense and anxious, walked taller, sensing a shift in the atmosphere of the palace. Elias, for his part, spent his days learning more about the empire, observing its strengths and weaknesses, and speaking with the Queen about ways to help her maintain control of her power. He did not interfere with governance or strategy unless asked, but his perspective proved valuable. Where others saw problems as obstacles, he saw patterns, solutions, and the human capacity to adapt. The Queen, recognizing his insight, began to rely on him more, not as a ruler, not as a guide to her power alone, but as a trusted companion in decision-making. But not everyone was pleased. Some ministers, those who had long held influence through fear of the Queen's isolation and unpredictable power, began to murmur their concerns. They saw Elias as an outsider, a human who had no place beside their sovereign, someone who could not possibly understand the complexities of Aurelian politics. "He interferes too much," one whispered to another. "He changes her focus. This is dangerous." The queen, however, did not let these concerns sway her. She had lived centuries listening to voices that doubted her, questioned her judgment, or feared her strength. Now, with Elias at her side, she felt more confident in herself and her decisions. She addressed the ministers calmly, without anger, explaining that the human had proven his resilience and insight, and that his presence helped her wield her power responsibly. Some ministers grumbled, but most fell silent, sensing the authority behind her words. One evening, during the height of the night cycle, the palace was suddenly shaken by a warning signal. Sensors throughout the city and the palace gardens detected unusual activity, a small but organized faction of rebels attempting to infiltrate the royal complex. Their goal was unclear, but the palace defense systems flagged them as a serious threat. Queen Serelith immediately recognized the danger. Normally, she would have faced such a situation alone, relying on her aura and the palace guards to repel intruders. But now, she had Elias. "Stay close to me," she instructed, her voice firm yet calm. Elias nodded, standing beside her as she allowed her empathic power to rise. The waves of her energy filled the chamber, alerting every guard and servant to prepare. But instead of the chaotic bursts of emotion that usually accompanied her power, the energy moved with precision, controlled by the stabilizing presence of Elias. The rebels were clever, trained to exploit moments of weakness, expecting that the queen's aura would be unpredictable, dangerous even to her own people. They entered the outer halls cautiously, prepared to strike, unaware that the queen had already sensed their presence. As they moved closer, the full force of her energy enveloped them. But it was not destructive. It was controlled, firm, and directed, enough to repel them without causing harm. Elias guided her quietly, whispering grounding techniques and reminding her to focus on direction rather than force. "Channel it like water," he said softly. "Flow around them. Don't push blindly." The queen followed his guidance, letting the storm inside her move in measured waves. The intruders stumbled and faltered, their plans disrupted by the queen's calm command of her power. Some of them froze, overwhelmed by the intensity of her aura, while others surrendered, realizing that force alone could not defeat a ruler so in control of herself. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the palace windows, the rebellion had been neutralized without bloodshed. The victory sent a powerful message throughout the empire. Citizens who had long feared their queen's isolation and power now witnessed a different side of her. Strength, guided by wisdom, tempered with restraint, and supported by an unexpected companion. The rumor spread quickly. A human had stood beside the queen during the night, and together they had repelled an attempted rebellion. Some were amazed, others skeptical, but all were forced to acknowledge that something had changed. For the queen, the night had proved more than the power of her aura. It had proved the value of trust, of allowing another to share the burden of her abilities. Elias had not only endured her storm, he had helped her shape it, focus it, and wield it responsibly. And in doing so, he had changed not just her, but the perception of the entire empire. Over the next several weeks, their nightly sessions became more than routine. They explored ways to teach the palace staff to interact with the queen safely, to understand the rhythms of her power, and to respect her authority without fear. Guards learned to recognize the signs of energy surges, and ministers slowly began to see the benefits of her calm leadership. Citizens, once distant and cautious, now felt a subtle shift in the aura of the royal palace, a presence that was powerful yet reassuring, inspiring confidence instead of fear. But challenges continued. Not all factions within the empire welcomed this change. Some traditionalists, long invested in maintaining power through fear and manipulation, saw the bond between queen and human as a threat. They whispered in secret chambers, plotting to undermine Elias's influence and return the queen to isolation. Yet every attempt to challenge them was subtly countered by the queen's newfound confidence. She did not strike blindly, nor did she act impulsively. Instead, she met each threat with thoughtful precision, often consulting Elias for insight into perspective and strategy. Their bond grew stronger in these trials. Elias began to understand not only the queen's power, but her heart, the loneliness that had defined centuries of her reign. He learned to interpret the quiet moments in her expression, the way her shoulders relaxed when she trusted someone, the small smiles she rarely allowed herself. And the queen, in turn, learned that the human could endure more than she had imagined, that his resolve and empathy were as strong as her own power, albeit expressed differently. One evening, after a particularly tense session in which they had countered a minor uprising before it could gain momentum, the queen allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She looked at Elias, standing calm but alert, and realized something profound. Her nights, once a time of fear and solitude, had become a space for growth, connection, and trust. The human had not merely survived her storm, he had transformed it into something constructive. "You have changed more than you know," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and awe. "I only helped," he replied modestly. "You did the work. I just made it easier to focus." "Do you know how rare that is?" she asked, stepping closer to him. "No one has ever helped me like this. No one has ever faced my storm without fear." Elias shrugged lightly. "Maybe that's because no one else believed they should." "I do." The queen studied him, realizing that his courage was not born from lack of fear, but from choice. He had chosen to stay beside her, night after night, and that choice had created a bond neither of them fully understood yet. It was not romantic, not yet, but it was trust, partnership, and something far deeper than companionship. The night passed quietly, without incident, and the first rays of dawn illuminated the palace gardens. The queen felt an unfamiliar sensation: peace. Her aura, once unpredictable and wild during the night, now pulsed gently, synchronized with her own heartbeat. She had faced the darkness and emerged not weakened, but strengthened, guided by the presence of a human who refused to abandon her. The Empire began to take notice of subtle but meaningful changes. Guards reported easier control of their posts, ministers found negotiations smoother, and citizens felt safer walking near the palace at night. The queen's reputation shifted from one of fear and isolation to strength, balance, and measured wisdom. And though some still doubted, most began to accept the reality that the human beside her had brought more than comfort. He had brought stability, insight, and the possibility of a better way of ruling. As the cycle continued, the queen realized another truth. Her power, once a solitary burden, could now be a shared force. She had spent centuries alone, fearing what she could not control. Now, with Elias, she saw that strength could be multiplied through trust and collaboration. It was a lesson centuries in the making, and she could finally live it in reality. One night, after the palace had settled and the city lights dimmed, the queen and Elias sat quietly in her chamber, observing the subtle glow of her aura. No words were needed. The silence was comfortable, filled with understanding and mutual respect. Each pulse of energy reminded them that together they had achieved something neither could have done alone. And for the first time in generations, the queen did not fear the night. She welcomed it, not as a time of danger, but as a time of growth, reflection, and connection. Her people were safer, her power was under control, and a human who had chosen to step forward had changed the course of her reign forever. It was a night of triumph, not just for the queen, but for the empire. And as dawn approached, the queen felt a quiet certainty. She was no longer defined solely by her power or her isolation. She was defined by her ability to trust, to adapt, and to grow alongside another being who had the courage to face what others would flee. And the human beside her, tired but resolute, knew that he had done more than survive her storm. He had become a part of it, a guiding presence, and a symbol of what could happen when courage and empathy met in a universe that often feared both. The Empire had begun to change. Queen Saralith, once known for her solitude and the fear her power inspired, now walked the halls of her palace with a quiet confidence. Citizens, guards, and ministers noticed the difference. She no longer appeared distant or unreachable. Instead, she radiated strength tempered by calm and an unusual warmth that drew people near. Her aura, once feared for its unpredictability, now pulsed with steady energy, as though the storm within her had found balance. Elias, the human who had stepped forward when no one else would, had become a constant presence by her side. Though he did not rule, he influenced through counsel, guidance, and his steadfast calm. His perspective, shaped by human resilience and empathy, brought a clarity that complemented the queen's power. He helped her see her authority not only as a force to command, but as a responsibility to protect, guide, and inspire her people. The change was not welcomed by everyone. Traditionalists and factions who had long relied on fear to maintain influence whispered in hidden chambers. They feared that the bond between the queen and a human threatened the old order. Some plotted minor rebellions, hoping to test whether her newfound balance would falter under pressure. But each attempt failed. The queen's aura, guided and anchored by Elias, proved more precise, more controlled, and more formidable than anyone had anticipated. One evening, the palace received urgent reports of an uprising at the city's outer districts. Rebels had gathered, expecting to exploit what they thought was a weakness: the queen's reliance on a human. They did not understand that her power, once a dangerous wild force, now moved with purpose. When the queen and Elias arrived at the command center, she observed the patterns of the approaching rebels with calm eyes. "Do you think they can withstand the aura?" Elias asked quietly. "They will not need to," she replied. "We will guide them without destroying." The queen stepped forward, allowing her empathic energy to radiate outward, but this time it was different. It was no longer a force of fear or unpredictability. It was precise, directed, and deliberate. The rebels felt it immediately, an overwhelming sense of their own uncertainty, not as punishment, but as guidance. Their aggressive movements slowed, confusion replaced determination. Some stumbled in hesitation, while others paused completely, sensing a strength they could neither fight nor ignore. Elias whispered instructions, reminding the queen to channel her power like water, flowing around the intruders instead of crashing over them. She followed, shaping the storm with subtle precision. Slowly, the rebels lowered their weapons, realizing that force alone could not achieve their goals. By the time dawn touched the horizon, the outer districts were calm, and not a single life was lost. This event became a turning point for the empire. Citizens who had long feared rebellion, chaos, and the queen's isolated power now recognized a new reality. Strength could be tempered with understanding, fear could be replaced with respect, and leadership could be shared, even if indirectly, through trust and guidance. The bond between the human and the queen had shown that vulnerability and courage together created a force greater than fear alone. Over the following weeks, the queen implemented reforms inspired by her nightly experiences. She opened sections of the palace to her citizens, at times previously forbidden, allowing her people to witness her power in controlled settings. Guards and attendants, trained to understand the rhythms of her aura, acted as intermediaries to prevent accidental overwhelm. Ministers, slowly seeing the benefits of a more open rule, adjusted their strategies to align with her guidance rather than oppose it. Elias, standing nearby during these changes, provided quiet support. He helped the queen remain grounded in moments of doubt, reminded her of the human perspective when decisions became complex, and offered insights into balancing authority with empathy. Though he did not seek power, his presence influenced the empire in ways few could articulate. The queen recognized this, and their bond, built through shared nights and trust, grew stronger with each passing cycle. One night, after a particularly long session of training the palace staff to work safely around her aura, the queen and Elias walked through the gardens, bathed in the soft glow of her controlled energy. The city beyond was quiet, peaceful. Citizens moved freely, unafraid, and the palace itself felt alive with calm energy instead of tense anticipation. The queen realized how far she had come from the isolated figure who had once walked these same halls alone. "You have changed everything," she said softly, her voice carrying over the gentle hum of her aura. Elias shook his head. "I only helped guide it. You made the change." The queen paused, studying him. "No human has ever done what you have. You faced my storm night after night without fear or hesitation. You showed me that strength can be shared, not endured alone. That is no small thing." He smiled faintly, brushing a hand along the railing of the garden bridge. "Perhaps. But it was also simple. Someone had to step forward. That's all." Her pulse quickened, and she felt a rare warmth spreading through her chest. It was not just admiration or gratitude. It was a connection, a bond forged in shared trials and quiet nights. She realized she could rely on him, not only to endure the storm, but to help her shape it, channel it, and use it to protect those she ruled. It was a partnership unlike any she had known. The next morning, during the formal assembly of the empire's leaders, Queen Seralith made an unprecedented declaration. She addressed her ministers, citizens, and allies from distant worlds, her aura calm but present, a visible symbol of her controlled power. She spoke of trust, unity, and the value of partnership. She introduced Elias to the assembly, not as a subordinate or advisor, but as a partner in guidance and support, someone whose courage had transformed the palace and the empire alike. The assembly responded with a mixture of surprise and respect. Some ministers whispered doubts, but most were inspired. The citizens outside cheered, recognizing that their queen had chosen to embrace change, not for herself alone, but for the good of the empire. This night, as the city lights flickered on, the aura of the palace was no longer a symbol of fear. It was a symbol of strength, balance, and hope. As the weeks passed, the empire adapted to this new era. Citizens engaged more with their leaders, guards felt empowered rather than anxious, and ministers collaborated rather than competed. The queen's once isolated power now radiated as a stabilizing force, influencing the empire in subtle but profound ways. All the while, Elias remained by her side, not as a ruler, but as a presence that anchored her strength, inspired trust, and modeled the quiet courage of someone willing to step forward when others would not. One evening, the queen stood on her balcony, looking out over the city she had long protected. Her aura pulsed gently in rhythm with her heart, steady and serene. Elias joined her, and for a moment, neither spoke. The quiet was comfortable, filled with understanding. She realized how much had changed in so little time. She had faced her fears, confronted her isolation, and learned to trust another being with her power and her vulnerabilities. And she had done so without losing her authority, without sacrificing the strength that had made her a queen. "You have taught me more than I could have imagined," she said quietly. "Not just about control, but about trust, partnership, and courage. You have changed me, and in doing so, you have changed the Empire." Elias smiled, his calm eyes reflecting the city lights. "I didn't change the Empire. You did. I only helped you see what was already inside you." She reached out, placing a hand near his, not touching, but acknowledging the bond they shared. It was a silent gesture, yet powerful. They had faced storms together, endured challenges that no one else could have survived, and emerged stronger because of it. The bond between them was unspoken, but undeniable, a partnership built on trust, courage, and mutual respect. The Empire flourished under their combined influence. Conflicts that might have escalated in the past were resolved with diplomacy and careful guidance. Citizens felt safer and more connected to their rulers. The Queen's power, once feared, became a tool for protection, guidance, and unity. And at the center of it all stood Elias, not as a ruler, but as a human who chose to step forward when no one else would. The Queen realized, finally, that she no longer needed to spend her nights in isolation. Her aura, once a source of fear, was now balanced by trust and understanding. She could face the darkness without trepidation, and she could do so knowing she was not alone. The Empire had seen her strength, her wisdom, and her courage, and it had grown stronger because of it. In the quiet hours before dawn, the Queen and Elias stood together, looking out over a city alive with possibility. They did not need to speak. Their presence alone communicated what words could not: partnership, trust, courage, and the quiet power of facing challenges together. The Queen felt something she had never experienced before, not just peace, but fulfillment. She had stepped beyond solitude into a new era of leadership, guided not by fear or isolation, but by connection and courage. And the human beside her, tired but resolute, knew that his choice had mattered. By standing forward when others would not, he had helped a queen reclaim her nights, stabilize her power, and transform an empire. He had shown that courage and empathy, combined with trust, could change worlds. And in that silent dawn, the Queen and the human shared a quiet understanding. They had faced the storm together, and the Empire would never be the same again. The Queen's nights were no longer spent alone. They were spent in shared purpose, in quiet guidance, and in the presence of someone who had the courage to stand beside her. And for the first time in generations, the Aurelian Empire knew not only strength, but hope, trust, and the power of choosing to step forward.